Climate finance, to me, as it's going right now, needs to be improved, needs to be focusing more on the vulnerable women and youth farmers over the world through climate change adaptation. The difference between adaptation and mitigation is simple. Adaptation is how do I change my life in a way that reduces the impact of a changing climate. Mitigation is how do I reduce my greenhouse gas emissions. For smallholder farmers, their carbon footprint is the lowest globally. The track on Canada climate change financing shows that only 20% is dedicated to adaptation. So we see there is still an opportunity for Canada to improve its impact on the life of vulnerable women by increasing its commitment to climate change adaptation. Women represent at least 80% of farm labor in developing countries, so they are at the center of our food system. We need to make sure that women take part into any program, policy, or innovation that comes into this area. Climate change is affecting billions of lives in developing countries, especially the lives of women right now. This is not the past, it's not the future, it is happening now. And Canada has the duty and the power to make that difference. Let's join our efforts and bring change in the lives of women over the world.
That was Dr. Pierre Cadet, Senior Regional Director for West Africa, North Africa, and the Middle East programs with the Mennonite Economic Development Associates. In the video, Dr. Cadet quickly sketches an important distinction between adaptation and mitigation with respect to climate change. Broadly, adaptation refers to how we change in response to changed circumstances. Mitigation refers to our attempts to alter or prevent change to those circumstances. Let's take a very simple example. You may have heard of the Corona 15, the weight gain many are experiencing as lockdown and stress eating take their combined toll. I don't know about you, but especially in the early months, it certainly felt like my jeans were shrinking. Facing that reality, I could do two things. I could adapt by biting the bullet and buying a larger size, or I could mitigate by eating better and getting my butt up off the couch. Yes, that was real life in the 1980s. We all, and I mean all, will have to adapt to climate change to some degree, even if that adaptation just takes the form of running the air conditioner more often and shifting our ski vacation to later in the season. First world problems to be sure. The task of climate mitigation, reducing the emissions of greenhouse gases to slow the pace of climate change, is also a task we must share, though differential impacts of different countries and social groups within those countries are extremely stark. For example, the United States currently accounts for just about 4% of global population, but 15% of global carbon emissions. On a per capita basis, that's a lot, but far from the worst. This figure breaks out per capita emissions by region or country, and the most egregious emitters are the petro- or oil economy-based states of the Middle East. On the other hand, as Dr. Cadet alluded to in his remarks, the people of sub-Saharan Africa contribute virtually nothing to the problem. Now, whether that's a good or bad thing, however, depends on how you view the historic link between carbon emissions and economic development. The massive emissions of Western economies and oil-exporting states are part of why standards of living in those regions are very high, and why standards of living and all the things that go with them, like infant mortality, public health systems, and educational opportunities, are still lagging in sub-Saharan Africa and other parts of the developing world. But you'll notice, too, that some wealthy Western countries have relatively lower emissions. The UK, for example, gets by on only about 40% of the per capita emissions of the United States. This is because of something known as the environmental Kuznets curve, which is a relationship between the environmental impact of an economy and its level of development, usually conceived of as gross domestic product, or GDP. At very low levels of development, environmental impact is low. As industrialization occurs, environmental impact becomes high. Finally, in the highest post-industrial states of development, environmental impact becomes lower again. Think of it this way. This is London around its conquering and re-establishment by the Romans in the 2nd century AD. This is London in the throes of the Industrial Revolution. And this is London now. It went from a wood-based city of about 50,000 to a smog-choked industrial town of 1 million by 1800. Today, all the smokestacks are gone, and London has gone from an industrial town to a town whose economy revolves around financial services, commerce, and technology. If we look at this same picture regarding emissions over the course of the past 3 centuries, however, the picture in terms of who is responsible for past carbon emissions is less complicated than the snapshot you saw earlier. This figure, by Raupak et al., shows that the economies of the developed world, so the United States, Japan, and other Western economies, only account for about 15% of global population, but are responsible for about 62% of historic emissions since the Industrial Revolution. Those emissions, and the massive economic development they fueled, are part of the reason those same countries have massive resources to invest in adapting to climate change. Let's take the issue of sea level rise. Like Bangladesh and some of the small low-lying island states, the Netherlands is deeply vulnerable to sea level rise. Only half of the country is more than 1 meter above the sea. But they've been throwing money and engineering talent at taming the oceans and storm surges for centuries. Here's the story of some of the more recent attempts to continue that process and secure the Dutch territory for future generations.
Ons land is een land van veerkracht. Al eeuwenlang trotseren we steeds hogere waterstanden en komen na elke klap weer boven. Door continu vooruit te kijken, leven we in de veiligste delta ter wereld. 30 jaar geleden al bouwde Rijkswaterstaat de Oosterscheldekering. Het grootste deltawerk van Nederland, maar liefst 9 kilometer lang. Dat deden we voor onze veiligheid en die van toekomstige generaties. Een enorme klus waar we zo'n 10 jaar mee bezig waren. Stap voor stap kregen we vaste grond onder de voeten. We toonden ruggengraat en boekten na jaren zwoegen een indrukwekkend resultaat. Het lijkt de normaalste zaak van de wereld dat de Oosterscheldekering honderdduizenden Nederlanders beschermt bij hoogwater. Maar dat het met 1 druk op de knop kan, is gewoon verbazingwekkend. En om dit zo te houden, geven we na 30 jaar trouwe dienst de Oosterscheldekering een flinke opknapbeurt. We pakken de schuiven in en geven ze een nieuwe beschermlaag. Samen met deskundige partners werken we aan een veilig, leefbaar en bereikbaar Nederland. Samen maken wij Nederland.
Now, the Dutch have been able to do this because they have one of the world's wealthiest economies, strong political leadership, and have been able to call on world-leading engineering expertise. They have the money, the will, and the know-how to throw at adaptation. Adaptation in a place like Bangladesh, however, looks far, far different.
Bangladesh is more at risk from climate change than almost any other country. It's prone to flooding, cyclones, and drought. Climate change may already be exacerbating those things.
জলবায়ু পরিবর্তনে যেমন এখন আমরা দেখতেছি যেটা জলবায়ু পরিবর্তন আগে যেন ধারাবাহিকতা ছিল বন্যার সময় বন্যায় খরার সময় খরা এখন কিন্তু এটা হচ্ছে না এখন দেখা যাচ্ছে খরার সময় হঠাৎ করে বৃষ্টি হচ্ছে বন্যাও হচ্ছে আবার যখন বৃষ্টির প্রয়োজন বৃষ্টি নেই অনাবৃষ্টি হচ্ছে রোদের জন্যই থাকা যাচ্ছে না
Bangladesh sits at the bottom of a delta plain where 3 main rivers converge. It's straddled by the melting Himalayan glaciers in the north and the rising waters of the Bay of Bengal in the south. That makes it highly susceptible to flooding. In 2009, Cyclone Aila tore through Bangladesh, uprooting trees, flattening homes, and destroying crops. Along the southern coastal regions, the storm left behind salty water in areas it had inundated. Fields that had once supported agriculture were deemed useless. To adapt to their newly saline environment, locals have had to change their source of food production. Through a project funded by the World Bank, villagers have switched to raising crabs, which thrive in salt water. Villagers rear the crabs and sell them at a local market, where they're then resold by buyers who ship them to Dhaka.
যেখান থেকে আইলা হয়েছে এই এলাকায় আর ধান পান নেই কোনো মিষ্টি কোনো গাছ নেই এই এলাকায় এখন আমাদের বাঁচি থাকতে হলে এই এলাকায় যেভাবে চলতেছে এইভাবে আমাদের চলতে হবে না চললে তো আমরা এই এলাকায় থাকতে পারবো না এই এলাকায় বসবাসই হবে না লবণ পানিতে হবে কি এইটি চিন্তা করতে হবে আমাদের লবণ পানিতে হবে কি মাছ চিংড়ি মাছ না হলে কাঁকড়া, এই দুটোই হবে।
Adding to this problem, in some areas, farmers deliberately inundate their lands with salty water so they can farm shrimp rather than crops, which is more profitable, but problematic for the environment. But the salinity creates another daunting problem. It pollutes local groundwater and makes it more difficult to access safe drinking water. Climate change is worsening this effect. Cyclones are more common, river flow has diminished, and salty water from the Bay of Bengal has been reaching ever farther into the coastal lands, travelling up rivers and polluting fresh water supplies that are used for drinking and irrigation.
বর্ষার পানি ধরে আমরা মানে জীবন যাপন করতাম, কিন্তু চৈত্র বৈশাখ মাস, এই চৈত্র বৈশাখ জ্যৈষ্ঠ এই 3 মাস আমাদের খুবই কষ্ট হতো। তখন লবণ পানি খেতে হতো আমাদের, বাজারের পানি কিনেও খাইছি, কিন্তু ও পানি তো অনেক দাম, আমাদের মতো ফ্যামিলি ওরকম পানি খাইয়ে পারে না।
NGOs working with the Community Climate Change Project have sought to address this problem. They've provided water tanks so locals can harvest rainwater and have helped fund a desalination plant that provides clean drinking water.
Bangladeshis are no more or less intelligent than the Dutch, and they are no less cognizant of the threats. Indeed, many Bangladeshis still depend on the environment for their livelihoods in ways most Dutch do not. What Bangladesh lacks is the carbon-fueled 2 or 3 centuries of economic development that allowed the Netherlands to become what it is today. So adaptation there revolves much, much more about changing livelihood strategies. A livelihood strategy is a set of activities involving securing water, food, fodder, medicine, shelter, clothing, and the capacity to acquire those necessities working either individually or as a group by using assets, both human and material, for meeting the requirements of the self and his/her household on a sustainable basis. Let's break that down a bit. First, what's an asset? An asset is just something useful for meeting economic commitments. I'll offer myself up as an example. I need some material assets to do my job. I need a computer, I need a desk, I need access to a library, I need this lovely Yeti microphone I have in front of me. Those are all material assets. But the most important part for someone in an egghead profession like mine is my human assets, my skills, education, and training that allow me to monetize talking for a living. It's not altogether a bad gig. Let's go back to our friend Jimmy Carolani, the Filipino fisherman we met last week. What kind of assets does he need to secure his livelihood? Well, he needs access to a boat, he needs a spearfishing setup, and he needs fins and a snorkeling mask. Those are all physical assets. But you give those same physical assets to me, and I'm going to starve to death, unless I drown first. I don't have the human assets, his skills, his knowledge of where to fish and when, and social connections to fish processors and marketers that turn those assets into a living for him and his family. Also, note that the livelihood strategies need to be sustainable. Living the millionaire lifestyle on a credit card might be possible for a while, but it's not sustainable, in the sense that it can't be done in perpetuity without undermining the ability to do it in the future. It's not sustainable unless that lifestyle is wedded to a millionaire economic status. These livelihoods can be more or less resilient. By resilient, I mean able to recover or bounce back from negative changes in our social, economic, political, and natural environment. Some livelihoods are more resilient than others, and this has nothing to do with how lucrative they are or aren't. For example, plumbing is not a glamorous livelihood, but it's a hyper-resilient one. Long after my teaching has been replaced by my own videos and an artificial intelligence to offer office hours, society will still need human plumbers to fix our pipes. It's just the nature of the beast. And we will need them in good economic times and bad. Flipping houses, or buying older homes and fixing them up to sell at a higher price, was a pretty lucrative livelihood strategy in the early 2000s when loans were cheap, but ground to a complete halt when the global financial crisis caused mortgages to be ever harder to come by. Flipping houses is on its way back now, which you should be afraid of. This is no less true of other livelihood strategies. Globally, the most common livelihood strategy is farming. If you randomly chose 10 working people from the planet Earth, 3 of them would be farmers. But farming as a livelihood is not uniformly distributed across countries. If you randomly chose 10 working people from Burundi, 9 of them would be farmers. If you did the same in India, 4 would be. If you did the same in the United States, you'd have to sample 100 people just to get 1 farmer. Now, whether farming is sustainable as a livelihood strategy largely depends on where in the world you are farming. If you're farming very close to the equator, it's becoming less and less viable and less resilient due to climate change. This map was created by Bill Klein, a colleague of mine at the Peterson Institute in 2007. The projections have been refined on the margins since then, but the overall story is still the same. In the aggregate, global output potential is forecast to decrease by between 6 and 18% in areas currently under cultivation by the 2080s, depending on the rate at which atmospheric carbon stimulates plant growth. However, these aggregate effects mask dramatic regional inequalities in agricultural production potential. Some major exporting countries at higher and lower latitudes, particularly the United States, Canada, Kazakhstan, New Zealand, Russia, and Ukraine, are forecast to increase their agricultural yields. Yields in many tropical developing countries, including major rice exporters Thailand, India, and Vietnam, are forecast to decline, in some cases by up to almost 40%. Overall, non-European developing countries are forecast to experience yield losses between 9 and 21%. That's a lot. And this is occurring against the backdrop of population growth, which is making arable land, or land on which farming is possible, more scarce in relative terms. In Niger, a West African country in the Sahel, arable land per capita went from 2.5 hectares, or roughly 2.5 rugby pitches like the one seen here, to less than 1 hectare between 1970 and 2020, due both to population growth and desertification. And it's not like Niger's agriculture has gotten 3 times more productive in that period. There's simply more pressure on agrarian livelihoods, which still account for 3/4 of employment in the country. What all of this means is that due to climate change, a lot of livelihood strategies are going to need to change. People will need to change the activities that allow them to meet their needs and the needs of their families. Their ability to change livelihoods is also dependent on their human and material assets. And those assets can have very different values under different circumstances. Let's go back to an earlier fantastical example. The kinds of people who thrive in George Miller's Mad Max world are very, very different from the ones that thrive in an advanced economy. I would be dead in about 20 minutes in this scenario. In this world, having a desert buggy hot rod and a casual willingness to kill or be killed are assets. In today's Denver, not so much. But back to reality. Some livelihood strategies are highly resilient because they are transportable. Lost your job as a surgeon in Syria because of the civil war? You're in luck, because globally there's high demand for surgery, and it's a skill that travels. The woman on the right in this picture is Arij Mulhelm, a Damascus-born Syrian woman who is now plying her trade as a surgeon in Leipzig, Germany. She is a refugee of the war, but her lifestyle strategy was remarkably resilient in the sense that it was portable. In contrast, for many Syrians who lack these kind of hyper-specific, in-demand skills that are highly portable, migration to Europe has not been as economically rewarding. Many Syrian white-collar professionals and people in service industries, which require deep knowledge of laws, customs, and access to social networks, are finding themselves working in construction or cleaning houses in Europe. Their assets aren't as transportable. Now, those are, of course, dignified, necessary roles, but they are far less economically rewarding than their previous ones. This lecture introduced several key concepts: mitigation, adaptation, livelihoods, and resilience. We'll discuss these all at length when we meet for class. In the meantime, think about your possible livelihood strategies moving forward, and whether or not and to what degree they are resilient to climate change.